Johnny Ringo was feared in the Old West, but his death in 1882 in Arizona remains one of the biggest mysteries of that time. His body was found leaning against a tree with a gunshot wound to the temple. The revolver was still in his hand. Suicide? A lot of people doubt it. Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were named as suspects, but no one ever proved anything. Deadwood came out of nowhere when gold was found in the Black Hills in '86. Within 2 years, thousands of people showed up chasing a quick fortune. With no real law, the town became a melting pot of prospectors, gamblers, and outlaws. That's where Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back while playing poker. Deadwood had no rules, and that was exactly why so many people went there. Martha Calamity Jane Canary arrived in Deadwood during the gold rush of 1876. She drank, gambled, and carried a gun like any man in town. Most of the stories about her are exaggerated, including her own. But one thing is a fact. During a smallpox outbreak, she cared for the sick when almost everyone else ran away. Deadwood was a lawless place, and she fit right in there. Bat Masterson became a legend in Dodge City in the 1880s. But what few people know is that he left it all behind and ended up in New York as a sports columnist. The guy traded his revolver for a typewriter. Back then, in Dodge City, he still carried the reputation of a gunslinger and gambler. He died in 1921, writing in a newspaper office, not in a shootout like many expected. Billy the Kid, around 1880. The guy who became a legend before he was 22. By then, he already had a list of killings behind him and was wanted in New Mexico. The crazy thing is, this image was almost lost to history. It was bought at an auction for $2 and later valued at millions. Billy was hunted down and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. A short life that left its mark on the Old West forever. Jim Beckworth was born enslaved in Virginia around 1798. His own father, a white farmer, eventually freed him. From there, the guy headed west and became one of the best-known mountain men of his time. He lived among the Crow, who adopted him as one of their own. He discovered a pass in the Sierras that still bears his name today. Here he was already in his early 60s, a veteran of a life few people had the guts to live. Rancho Santa Anita, California, 1890. Before it became a horse racing track, this place was real cowboy country. These guys drove cattle on one of the biggest estates in Southern California, land that had already passed through Mexican and Spanish hands. The interesting thing is that just a few years later, all of this would disappear to make way for the suburbs of Los Angeles, burying an entire era of the American West. In the 1880s, Arizona was still lawless territory. These Apaches were tried and convicted in Globe, a mining town where tensions between settlers and native people often exploded. Before being sent to the feared Yuma Territorial Prison, known as Hell in the Desert, this moment was recorded. Few who went in there came out the same. Wyatt Earp spent decades being remembered as the gunslinger from the OK Corral. But late in life, he lived quietly in Los Angeles and visited Hollywood sets. Here he appears on January 11, 1929, already in poor health. 2 days later, a bladder infection took the last big name of the Old West. He was 80 years old, and few people knew he was still alive. Pancho Villa, in 1912, when he was still a rebel leader fighting against the Mexican government. Few people know this, but he was the only foreign leader to invade American territory in the 20th century. In 1916, he attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico, and the U.S. Army sent thousands of soldiers after him without managing to capture him. The guy challenged 2 countries and made it out alive. On October 26th, War, William Bloody Bill Anderson walked into a trap set by Union troops in Missouri. This Confederate guerrilla had terrorized the region with brutal attacks, including the massacre of unarmed soldiers in Centralia weeks earlier. When his body was found, they say he was carrying ropes with human scalps. The war in Missouri was different. There were no rules. In 1899, two Salish warriors rode across the lands of Montana that had once been entirely theirs. The government had already pushed the tribe onto a reservation decades earlier, but these men still kept the old way of life. The name Flathead was given by mistake by white people. The Salish never flattened their heads like other peoples in the region. Even so, the name stuck and remains in history books to this day. Looking Glass led the Nez Perce on a 700-mile escape, trying to reach Canada in 1811. The U.S. Army chased men, women, and children across mountains and rivers. He was killed by a sharpshooter just 40 miles from the Canadian border. His tribe almost made it to freedom, but the final siege at the Battle of Bear Paw ended one of the most impressive retreats in American history. Castle Gate, Utah, a little town tucked into a narrow canyon where coal ran everything. Entire families depended on the mine. In 924, an explosion killed 172 miners all at once. Many of those families who posed proudly in front of their homes lost fathers and sons in that disaster. The town eventually shut down decades later, swallowed up by the same industry that created it. In 1886, Geronimo and his warriors were hiding in the Sierra Madre in Mexico when General Crook went after him to negotiate a surrender. On March 27th, Geronimo agreed to turn himself in, but 3 days later, on the 30th, he simply disappeared again. The guy slipped away right under the U.S. Army's nose and kept running for another 5 months. Deadwood, 86. A jumble of tents and cabins thrown together in a narrow gulch in Dakota Territory. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, and thousands of men left everything behind to try their luck there. It was Lakota territory by treaty, but no one cared. It was in this chaos that Wild Bill Hickok showed up, already famous as a gunslinger and already marked to die at a poker table weeks later. Gila Bend, Arizona, 1880. In the middle of the desert, where the heat could melt even your will to live, this bar called Whiskey the Road to Ruin didn't hide what it was. The name said it all. Whiskey was the road to ruin. Even so, the place was always packed. Back then, bars in Arizona were a bank, a courthouse, and a morgue all at once. A lot of people walked in on their own 2 feet and were carried out. Winter of 1887, Deadwood region, South Dakota. 2 miners, McMillan and Hubbard, went out to hunt deer in the brutal cold of the Black Hills. Back then, hunting wasn't a sport, it was survival. Deadwood still carried the reputation of its wild gold rush days, and anyone living there had to fend for themselves to keep from going hungry during the freezing months. Seth Kinman was a hunter, fiddle player, and natural-born showman. He lived in the mountains of Northern California and became famous for making chairs out of elk antlers. He gave 4 of them as gifts to different presidents. Lincoln was one of them. Kinman would show up in Washington dressed like a frontiersman, shocking the politicians in the Capitol. By 1865, he was already an unlikely celebrity in a country in the middle of the Civil War. In 1874, the Southern Paiutes were captured in a rare image. These people lived in the desert of what is now Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, long before any settlers arrived. They survived in brutal conditions, using skills most of us wouldn't last a week with. The interesting thing is that few Americans know their history, even while living on land that was once their home. This is Chief Eagle of the Salish tribe, photographed in 1906 on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. By then, the federal government had already pushed the Salish onto land that wasn't originally theirs. The Salish people resisted for decades before accepting removal. What few people know is that they were one of the last groups to give in, only leaving the Bitterroot Valley in 1891 under military escort. Red Hawk was an Oglala Lakota warrior who lived in the Badlands, an arid region of South Dakota. Edward Curtis captured this image around 1905, at a time when the U.S. government had already forced the Lakota onto reservations. What stands out here is the steady gaze of a man who saw his world change completely in a single generation. The Oglala were the same people who defeated Custer at Little Bighorn. Washakie led the Shoshone for almost half a century and did something few Native chiefs managed to do. He negotiated directly with the U.S. government and secured land for his people without war. The guy was so respected that even the U.S. Army asked for his help in military campaigns. This image was taken by William Henry Jackson around 1870 in Wyoming. Geronimo spent 27 years as a U.S. prisoner of war. In this photo at Fort Sam Houston, Texas in 1886, he had just surrendered for the last time. The government never let him return home to Arizona. He died in captivity in 1909. Before that, the Army needed 5,000 soldiers to capture a group of just 36 Apaches. Charles Bowles looked like a distinguished gentleman from San Francisco. A well-tailored suit, gray beard, polite manners. No one would have suspected he was Black Bart, the outlaw who terrorized Wells Fargo stagecoaches for 8 years. On November 3, 1883, he attempted his 29th robbery, but this time he left a handkerchief at the crime scene. Police traced the laundry mark and found their way to him. The detail that brought it all down: a piece of cloth. Ouray, Colorado, around 1890. This little town tucked into the Rocky Mountains was a full-on mining boom town. The Beaumont Hotel was the spot for the elite. Miners who got rich overnight stayed there. The carriage out front wasn't just transportation, it was status. The interesting thing is that Ouray became known as the Switzerland of America, and the hotel still stands today, more than 130 years later. Devil's Tower, Wyoming, around 1890. Native Americans had already revered this place for centuries before settlers arrived. It's more than 260 meters of solid rock rising out of nowhere in the middle of the plains. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt made it the first national monument in the United States. The interesting thing is that geologists still debate how this formation really came to be. No one is absolutely sure. Bass Reeves, around 1902, in Kansas. Born enslaved in 1838, he escaped during the Civil War and lived among native nations in Indian Territory. After the war, he became the first black U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi. In more than 30 years of service, he arrested around 3,000 criminals and was never shot, even while constantly getting into gunfights. Few lawmen had a resume like that. Mickey Free lost an eye as a child during an Apache attack. Raised among the Apaches, he became one of the most feared scouts in the U.S. Army. He spoke several languages and knew the territory like no one else. Here he appears with his two wives, Ethle and Ochahe, around 888. Few men moved between two worlds so different and survived to tell the story. A miner crosses the Nevada desert with his wagon and his donkeys. Around 1900, this stretch of dry land was nothing more than a stop in the middle of nowhere. No one imagined Las Vegas would be born there. Within a few years, the construction of a railroad and the discovery of underground water would turn this forgotten desert into one of the most famous cities on the planet. After traveling more than 1,700 kilometers trying to reach Canada, Chief Joseph stopped just 60 kilometers from the border. His people were exhausted, hungry, and surrounded by the U.S. Army in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana. On October 5, 1997, he surrendered and said words that went down in history: "I will fight no more forever." That's how the Nez Perce War ended. Bob Ford used this .44 caliber Smith & Wesson No. 3 to shoot Jesse James in the back in 1982. Ford was a member of James's own gang and accepted a secret deal with the governor of Missouri. The shot hit him in the back of the head while James was straightening a picture on the wall. In 2003, the gun went up for auction and sold for $350,000. The interesting thing is that Ford was never treated like a hero. The public despised him for the rest of his life. Edward W. Johnson, Deputy U.S. Marshal, appears here on the left with no idea what was coming. Shortly after this photo was taken, he would lose his right arm in circumstances that marked his life forever. Back then, being a lawman meant putting your body in the line of fire every single day. Johnson paid that price in a brutal way. Pancho Villa went from wanted outlaw to commanding an entire army in Mexico. The guy attacked American territory in 1916, and the U.S. sent thousands of soldiers after him. They never managed to catch him. He met generals, made deals with gringos, and became a legend while he was still alive. In 1923, he was assassinated in an ambush. To this day, no one knows for sure who gave the order. Archie Clement, on the left, got the nickname Little Archie because of his size, but don't be fooled. He was one of the most feared guerrillas in Missouri. He fought alongside Bloody Bill Anderson and played a central role in the Centralia Massacre in 1864, when dozens of Union soldiers were executed after surrendering. After the war, Clement kept causing trouble until he was gunned down in 1876 at age 20. Calamity Jane, visiting Wild Bill Hickok's grave in Deadwood, 1900. He was murdered with a shot to the back of the head during a poker game in 1986. Jane always swore the two had been married, though there is no document proving it. When she died 3 years later, her friends honored her request and buried her right next to him in Mount Moriah Cemetery. In 1873, Timothy O'Sullivan captured something few Americans knew about. A Navajo family gathered around a loom near Old Fort Defiance, New Mexico. The Navajo were already weaving blankets so valuable they were used as trade goods between tribes. Each pattern carried stories passed down from generation to generation, traditions the U.S. government would try to erase in the years that followed. Before becoming president, Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother on the same day. Devastated, he left everything behind and went to live as a rancher in the Badlands of Dakota. There, he hunted, broke horses, and slept out in the open. That period shaped the man who would later call Woodrow Wilson a Byzantine logothete, backed by incompetence and cowards. Few people know that Tough Teddy was born out of pain. Custer trusted this man more than any other scout. Bloody Knife was half Arikara, half Sioux, and knew those plains like no one else. The two served together for years, but at Little Bighorn, in June '86, Bloody Knife was killed right at the start of the fight. Custer lost his eyes on the battlefield just when he needed them most. Hours later, he was dead too. A cowboy loses control as his horse rears up hard on the plains of Montana. Leighton Huffman captured scenes like this in the late 1890s, when the Old West was already disappearing. Huffman was one of the few photographers who lived among cowboys and buffalo hunters, documenting a way of life that would stop existing within just a few years. What he captured here is the real risk these men faced every day. Tombstone, Arizona, 1880. The town had barely been founded a year earlier, and was already buzzing with miners, gamblers, and gunslingers. This California store sold everything from boots to ammunition. Before long, the shootout at the OK Corral would put the place on the map forever. But back then, the real gold was in business, not in the mines. The people selling shovels got richer than the ones digging. These guys were caught by American soldiers during the punitive expedition of 1916. After Pancho Villa attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico, General Pershing crossed the border with thousands of men to hunt him down. Villa escaped, but several of his men ended up captured. The U.S. never managed to catch Villa, and the operation became a trial run for what would come in World War I.